Hello. So I'm Megan Page, in case I haven't met you yet. I just want to introduce this panel. So I guess in the spring, there were a few Christian women who got together, and we were kind of trying to put our heads together and think, what can we do to, affect the future of Christian philosophy? What does that look like? Where are we going? What's our direction? What's kind of our vision? And one consistent theme in those conversations was we feel like there's just a need to broaden the scope of what we consider to be philosophy and who we consider to be an important contributor to philosophy, right? Who is a philosopher? What is philosophy? Those are questions that are very often policed in different communities and in different ways. And we wanted to kind of open them up and reconsider them as a community. So what does it mean to ask those questions? Well, what we want to do today is kind of re-engage in that question in a sort of experimental fashion. So we're doing something really different than what you normally see at a philosophy talk, especially as the keynote. So thanks to Andrew and Kevin for making this happen. But we're going to put together just sort of a series of very short talks. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from a bunch of different people, all of whom I consider to be very important philosophers, who are doing really important work and really different kinds of work. And we kind of just want to allow each of them to speak in a particular way to who they are and what they're doing in philosophy. And each of them is speaking to sort of a different aspect of their identity in doing that and answering kind of different particular questions. So we're going to go ahead and let them give some short answers to some questions that you might have. And again, these will be really short talks because we wanted to include as many people as possible. And we also want to leave time for Q&A. So this is definitely an introduction to a big question, to a lot of big questions. And we recognize that. But, we're hoping that this is really just the start of a conversation that we're going to have together for many years as we journey into the future as the SCP. So please save any questions you have for the end of all the talks. We're going to just kind of go through the talks, and then we'll have a general Q&A at the end for the panel. And we're going to start off, without further delay, by hearing from Dolores Morris. And she's going to discuss for us, kind of answer this question, what is the role of teaching, and what is the role of teachers in Christian philosophy?
Thank you. So, I'm Dolores Morris. It's terrible, it rhymes, but that is who I am. I am, full disclosure here, I am a full-time instructor at the University of South Florida. So I have a full-time permanent position that I really love and I really enjoy, and I think it's really important, but it is not a tenure-track position. So when I say that I think we need to reach out to more people who don't have tenure-track positions, I recognize there's a little bit of bias here, right? But I love my job, and I am a Christian philosopher, and this is the Society of Christian Philosophers. So I believe that teaching is an essential and a tremendously important part of being a Christian philosopher. And for that reason, and for other reasons, I believe that the SCP would be well served by an increased emphasis on teaching and an increased effort to involve those Christian philosophers whose careers primarily involve teaching. Again, bias here, but in what follows, I want to briefly touch upon why we should do this, how we should do it, but also who those teachers are. And this is going to get to a few of the questions that we had for Nick's keynote last night about where people might be teaching philosophy. So first, why? I think it's safe to assume that just about everybody in this room teaches philosophy, right? But no, we know this, but notice that not one session says anything at all about what we teach, about why we teach it, or about how we teach it. I know that as a teacher at a large state school, I would really value hearing from other people in similar situations and from other people in very different teaching situations. I think this would be valuable to me. And this is maybe more controversial, but I would also say that for the overwhelming majority of us, and this is an anniversary conference, so maybe not as large a majority, the classroom is where we're going to yield our greatest influence. If the SCP is interested in finding ways to be more influential, then this strikes me as an obvious direction in which to move. We can and do lament the ways in which our undergraduates lack certain basic conceptual frameworks. We can and do complain to each other about the difficulties of persuading students of anything when truth is just not a big deal in their minds, right? But how much better if we instead chose to collectively do something about it? We do as individuals, but wouldn't it be remarkable if we found a way to help each other here, to actually talk with each other about what the great needs are in undergraduate communities right now and how, as teachers, we can do something about that. Writing papers to be read by academic philosophers is one part of being a Christian philosopher, and it is an important part. For some of us, it will be our legacy, and our legacy will be great, but for most of us, as hard as it is to accept, most of what we write and publish will be forgotten. But we encounter dozens, or in my case, hundreds of students in the classroom every year. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that some of these students can and do have life-transforming moments in the philosophy classroom. It's a great deal more difficult to quantify those results or even to see them for ourselves sometimes. I don't think you always know whose lives you've changed. But I think it's important, I think it's valuable, and I think it's worth prioritizing. And finally, it's an empirical fact that non-tenure earning positions are disproportionately held by women and other minority groups. I'm an example of that. I'm a female with a non-tenure earning position. I don't really want to go in today here into the factors that contribute to that. But I just want to note that if we're more proactive about involving teachers, we will be a more diverse group. It will just happen organically. So why should we value teaching? Because philosophy is essential and not just for philosophers. I believe that sincerely. I hope you also believe that. But teaching is how we get the tools and methods and values of philosophy into the minds of non-philosophers. And that's important. And the fact that we'll end up being a more diverse group is, I think, just a great bonus. So how? First, I'm really not suggesting that we turn our conferences into pedagogical workshops, right? Even I would really hate to see that happen, and teaching is what I do. But don't we have room for a pedagogical workshop at our conferences, right? Isn't there room for one? Couldn't we have a panel on what it's like to teach at a state school? Or a panel on what it's like to teach at a Christian school, because that's very different from teaching at a secular liberal arts college, which is very different from teaching at a community college. So can't we have a panel on that, right? Or a panel on what texts you find to be really useful in teaching. I'm currently teaching a literature class. I am a philosophy professor. The class is entitled Philosophical and Religious Themes in Literature. And I spent really probably 8 months coming up with a reading list. And then, I got it to a spot where I felt like this is a class I would really love to take. How do I get to the spot where this is a class that I can teach? But you know what? I really, and the countdown was ticking at that point, right? But I really learned a lot, right? I learned so much. And I would love to share that. I would also have benefited from hearing from other people who had taught, like Julian of Norwich instead of Jaegwon Kim, which is what I typically teach, right? Or Flannery O'Connor or Camilla Shamsi, right? How do we find the philosophy there? Well, I've done some work there. Wouldn't it be great if there were a venue here to talk about that? And likewise, in our journal. I think Faith in Philosophy shouldn't become a journal of teaching philosophy, but it should be in part a journal of teaching philosophy. There should be articles about what it is like to be a Christian philosophy teacher and how you can do it well and how not to do it, right? These are all things we could learn from. I also think these would be really simple changes, right? I think these would be simple, effective changes that would benefit the Society of Christian Philosophers. But finally, what do I mean by Christian philosophers, by teaching philosophy? Obviously, I mean teaching philosophy in the college classroom. But that's not actually all that I mean. As we heard in last night's Q&A, there are other venues in which philosophy might be taught, and I would say should be taught. I personally know 2 men who got their PhDs in philosophy. I think they were both at Baylor. And deliberately, one first and then the other followed, went to a small Christian college preparatory school. And over the course of a few years, this school is where I went. This is how I know them. I went many years ago. They've just transformed the curriculum at that high school. They have just totally overhauled the way that that school views education. That is influential. That is Christian philosophy. They are Christian philosophers, but they're not here. So why aren't they here? And wouldn't we benefit from them being here? And how do we get them here? And I think, how do we get them here? I really am a big fan of simple answers like, we invite them. So many questions. I feel like, well, how do we get our undergraduates more involved? Well, why don't we invite them, right? Why don't we ask them to come? And yeah, make financial ways for that to be possible. But also, if we're going to invite them, there should be something here for them. And so if we're inviting Christian philosophers who teach at the high school level, there should be at least something on teaching here. And again, not that this should be at the cost of everything else, but I just think we have room. I think we have room for it. As a quick response to last night's questions, I do teach adult classes at my church. My husband does as well. We're a two-philosopher household. Michael Morris, down at USF, also is my husband. And we kind of tag team. We take turns teaching one of these. We live in the South where everyone that goes to church on a Wednesday night. I'm a New Yorker. This was totally new to me. But Wednesday night church is just as fixed as Sunday morning in the South. And that's where they have classes. But so here's what I would say. If you are wondering, like the questioner last night, how do we make a difference in the church? You go to your church and you ask. I think it can be that simple. I think you just speak to the leadership at your church and you say, this is what I do. How can I be of service? And if they say, we have no use for you, I don't know, maybe find another church, maybe just be okay with that. But I just doubt that they would say that, right? I think they're much more likely to say, I'm so glad that you asked, right? Okay. I got way off my notes here. In conclusion, I would just say I would love to see the Society of Christian Philosophers better reflect the reality of what being a Christian philosopher entails. If so much of what we do is teaching, and if so much of our influence can be found in the classroom, graduate, undergraduate, also maybe high school and church communities, also maybe not just churches, Socrates in the City is awesome and really reproducible on a smaller scale in your town, right? Well, then let's see more of that here in our conferences and in our journal.
Thank you. So next up, we have Kate Finley, and she is at Hope College, and she is going to sort of answer for us, what is the importance of engaging the community in philosophy?
Thanks. Yeah, the end of your talk was a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about.
That was awesome.
Nice. So yeah, Kate Finley. I'm by no means an expert on community engagement, but I am very passionate about it, and I've stepped out and tried some things. When I was at Notre Dame recently, so I taught through a prison education program down there. I'm going to teach at Calvin's similar program in the spring. I taught a class at the local Center for the Homeless, and I've also integrated some significant community engagement components in the last few classes I've taught. And I know that plenty of you have done really interesting things like this as well. So I'm in large part speaking about my experiences, those specific experiences. So I'm going to just briefly outline some of the benefits that I think we should care about as philosophers and specifically as Christian philosophers, benefits of community engagement as philosophers, some potential objections that I hear all the time, and then also what some first concrete steps we might take are. So first of all, community engagement can obviously refer to a lot of different things. I'm specifically talking about how we engage those outside the walls of the university in the broader community as philosophers, and specifically in our capacity as teachers. So this is obviously not the only way to do community engagement in philosophy, just one kind. And examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about I just gave, and also too, a great example is teaching in some capacity or leading discussions in your local church and other various community organizations, and also integrating community engagement components into your university classes. So I would guess that many of you, maybe not all of you, agree with or at least find compelling the idea that it's good for some philosophers to be involved in community engagement. Or maybe you even find plausible the claim that some philosophers, maybe some Christian philosophers, ought to be involved in community engagement. But I would guess that for some of you, most of the time, these thoughts don't inform how you yourself spend your time. And I know for me, that is often the case. So I know for some of you, I'm preaching to the choir, and you already are on board with the importance of this. And if that's the case, I would really encourage you to share your experiences with community engagement, especially in these kinds of settings. I think the SCP can really be a great forum for sharing ideas that we've had and kind of swapping advice and things like that. And for those of you who have your doubts, I'm just going to present some reasons why I think we should be more involved in this, and also why it might be more like accessible and possible than you previously thought. So first, teaching outside the traditional walls of the university, it brings philosophy to a wider audience, and especially to those who might not normally have access to it. And simply, I think if we think philosophy is important, that's a good reason to want to facilitate access to it to a broader range of people. And many pre-existing programs can benefit not only from your skills and time, but also from your influence and other resources that you possess. Also, it helps us become better teachers to a broader and more diverse array of students. So often teaching students who might normally not end up in a typical university classroom challenges us, but in the end helps us improve our teaching. For example, teaching a co-ed group of mid-20-year-old students at Notre Dame versus through the Westfield Prison Program, all of my students were male and ranged in age from 25 to mid-60s. And that's just like one way in which they were obviously different than who you normally might get in a university class. And it really helped improve my teaching. Second, so I think by integrating community engagement components into our classes, there are lots of benefits to this. It increases student retention of material. So there's a lot of research on this. And so insofar as it's a form of experiential learning, it helps students to better connect philosophical concepts to their everyday lives and realize that philosophy is very relevant. It also informs and often alters students' trajectory in and after college. So participation in community engaged classes often correlates with increased volunteerism, engagement in various forms of social justice, and serious consideration of related careers. And they've shown this to be the case not just in the months and years right after the class, but like years down the line after they've left college. And then lastly, it can also provide you with a broader range of experts to draw upon regarding various topics that you might teach. So simple example, for a unit in one of my classes in which we talked about race, we went to the South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, and there we heard from people who had lots of expertise, and they were especially able to connect the topics that we were talking about in class to South Bend, like our local community's history with these issues. And students overwhelmingly said that this was a unit that really stuck out to them. They remembered it. They found it very engaging. So now a few brief objections that have come from friends and colleagues, and I often pose some version of these to myself when I don't necessarily feel like putting in the effort. So one objection, you might think something like, well, community engagement might be Kate's thing, but that's not my thing. Or if you're a Christian, you might think, God has called me to do other things that don't allow for this kind of community engagement. I don't have the time, I don't have the emotional capital to do this. So in response, I would just say, if you can honestly reflect on yourself as a philosopher and perhaps as a Christian philosopher and maintain that because of these other commitments, you don't have the time or capacity for this, then more power to you. And I know that for some of you, this is definitely true. However, I know that when I say things like this to myself, it's often an excuse to avoid things that take effort and pull me out of my comfort zone. And so I would just encourage you to maybe challenge this thinking in yourself and others, and especially reflect on ways in which you might be able to make simple changes that don't require mountains of effort to just kind of, begin to explore different kinds of community engagement. Another objection, you might think that, because of certain things about my personality or makeup, or precisely because I am a philosopher, or at least in my capacity as a philosopher, I'm ill-suited or ill-equipped to do community engagement. And in response, of course, for some of you, this might be true, but I think for many of you who think it's true, it's not. So again, we're not talking about this wide array of volunteer opportunities. We're talking about opportunities that particularly take advantage of your skills as a philosopher and as a teacher. And regarding personality, it often takes stepping out and trying things like this and pushing through the awkwardness and discomfort to see that it's in fact much more possible and worthwhile than you might have previously thought. And a final objection, lots of versions of this, but basically seems patronizing. Seems like we're imposing ourselves and our values on the community. And honestly, some version of this concern comes up for me repeatedly and often causes me to reevaluate what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And so to be clear, I'm not saying that as philosophers, we are God's gift to our community and we must go out and educate the masses, nor am I advocating that your university classes engage in poverty tourism or kinds of community engagement that are often detrimental to the communities they engage with. And I'm very intentional in conveying this to my students, that the goal of the community engagement portion of our class is not to go out and help people. And so I acknowledge this is a very real risk, but I don't think it's a reason to give up and not try it at all. Rather, I think it's all the more reason to try and do this within a community of people like the SCP, and to take advantage of the expertise of people who have been doing this for years and researching it specifically, have written many books and articles about it. And I think given where we're at now, we ought to err on the side of stepping out in faith and trying it, rather than trying to be too cautious. So just some, quick concrete steps. And I also have plenty of examples that I can offer in Q&A. But so talk to people or accompany people within your circles who are involved in community engagement. Get in contact with relevant centers on your campuses or local community organizations, and especially think about organizations and churches and things where you already have pre-existing connections and relationships, because those often provide much better community engagement opportunities. And again, if you're involved in community engagement, share about it, both the positives and the negatives. I think this could really be a venue for having more of these conversations. So the upshot is that I think there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of our skills, resources, and motivations, both as individuals and as an organization, that could be put to really good use in community engagement opportunities. So both through pre-existing organizations and through kind of brainstorming ways that we might be able to create even more opportunities and be on the forefront of some of this work in the future.
Thank you, Kate. All right, so next up we have Jill Hernandez, and she is going to speak to us. She's going to offer us a modest proposal of why we should not include women in the canon of philosophy.
So I was initially asked to give a talk on why we should include women in philosophy, and when my mom talked to me about, like, what are you talking about? And I said, they want me to talk about why we should read women in philosophy, and she's not a philosopher, and there was a long pause, and she said, why would you be asked to talk about that? And I thought that was really astute, as most things my mother says. So in what follows, I want to provide the strongest reasons that have been provided by reviewers, expert philosophers at conferences, and my own mentors and colleagues for why we should not read women in philosophy. So although we all know that arguments from authority are fallacious, the pragmatic truth of our field is that the gatekeepers, so those who make final decisions about who should get into conferences and who should get published and who should get grants and who should get tenure and who should get promotion, all depend on the gatekeeper, the authority that universally we listen to out of our own self-interest. So it makes good sense to listen to their actual, and in some cases written, reasons to me about why we should not read women in philosophy. So the first reason we should not read women in philosophy is that truth is not gendered. Quote, I don't believe evil is gendered, unquote. The single-line referee report on a major grant proposal rejection taught me so much. For example, it taught me that you can write a major grant proposal without invoking the words feminism, feminist, standpoint epistemology, misogyny, ethics of care, point of departure, and yes, even the word gender, and still get a single-line referee report that says, I don't believe evil is gendered, which is justified because the proposed project contrasted women's views of evil in the early modern period with male philosophers, which so obviously suggests that evil is gendered. Philosophers are at risk of thinking that truth about evil is gendered if they read women in the early modern period of philosophy. Reason number 2. Reading women is a fad. As we heard last night astutely, there are fads which permeate philosophy rashly and can still make an impact. Now, fads aren't in themselves bad, of course. Many good male philosophers have won tenure and promotion in their careers on fads. But we ought to take special care in attempting to read women canonically. The canon of philosophy, dear ones, is tried and true. It resists change because its topics are central to the quest for first philosophy, whereas reading women in faddish areas is mostly innocuous because those topics will fade away. Injecting women in conversations in which they were not present wrongly shapes our conception of what philosophy is itself. And speaking of fads, this navel-gazing that many philosophers are currently engaged in over what counts as philosophy will be short-lived. Philosophy has been an investigation of first truths since the time of Plato, not Xanthippe. Reading women is a fad because women are not present in the canon, and the canon cannot change because it reflects timeless, eternal truths. Reason number 3. You know women didn't make contributions to philosophy until Anscombe, Millikan, and Foote, right? One exception is Princess Elizabeth. I mean, Princess Elizabeth is someone I can see reading because of her interactions with Descartes. Now, unlike some of Descartes' other interlocutors, you can see in her letters that Elizabeth really had engaged and understood him. Of course, even Elizabeth never made significant advances past Descartes, but that is okay. There aren't any women who have contributed significantly to philosophy in any period except today. But as a historical note, we can diversify our syllabi by including a person like Princess Elizabeth. Students will love reading a woman. And then we can contrast the dark days in philosophy when women weren't allowed to do philosophy with today, when we have a few really important women like Sally Haslinger. And we can even teach our 2 really important Christian women, Marilyn and Eleanor. Okay. Reason number 4. Feminism isn't real philosophy, but you should teach it because teaching women can attract more women. So this is extremely compelling for several reasons. First, reading women just means doing feminism, sometimes even feminist epistemology and feminist ethics. To be clear, feminist epistemology and feminist ethics are valuable for the field because they create a space for women who do not have the analytic chops to do epistemology and ethics. As a recent well-known analytic philosopher and member of the SCP recently said, ethics is the kitchen of philosophy. And it's obvious why. That doesn't mean that expanding philosophy to include contemporary women isn't wise. Rather, it's fantastic for the discipline because it might make more women take our classes and contribute to our semester credit hours. Who knows? They could even go on and be good feminist epistemologists or feminist ethics themselves, and they could do a great job because they will know which women to pick and what obscure poetry journal to find them in. My job is to teach philosophy with integrity by sticking to real, time-tested philosophical problems. And reason number 5. Have you read 1 Timothy 2? I'm okay with some of the cultural changes that have happened. I really like my smartphone. But I'm a believer. So I'm committed to Paul's view in which he writes, quote, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing." I've had 2. "If they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety," unquote. Now, as much as I am for, women's rights at the voting booth, domestic peace and harmony, that's great, I can't square my theology with allowing women to be read in philosophy. And so allowing women to exert some kind of epistemic authority over a man. It's permissible for women to exert influence in many other fields, but philosophy is so closely related with what we do in theology that women ought not to be allowed to be read. So I've ruminated over these 5 reasons, these reasons that have been given to me by my epistemic authorities in this field. And I've made a conclusion that I should listen, if not submit. To 1, truth is not gendered. Reading women is a fad. Women didn't make philosophical contributions until what? Feminism isn't real philosophy, and 1 Timothy 2. I believe that you can only conclude with me that women ought not to be read in philosophy.
Thank you very much, Jill. Okay, next up, we have Kristen Irwin, and she is going to talk to us about how Christian philosophers can and should engage with mental health issues as they often arise in our profession.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm from Loyola, Chicago. I was going to talk about ladies and being a lady. That's been addressed many times in the context of this conference, and I'm encouraged by the many ways in which it's been addressed. My comments now are kind of superfluous, so I'm just going to say keep going with all that. And so since that's been adequately addressed, I want to address a slightly different problem, which may have a wider application. Christian philosophers have done an excellent job thinking about how to be a Christian doing philosophy. That is, I think we figured out how to do philosophy about the content of the Christian faith. I want to press us now in the direction of practicing philosophy Christianly. That is, what practices ought we to be instantiating in our discipline that mark us as followers of Christ? This topic may warrant a whole conference of its own. I am not offering to organize it. But at least part of the answer to this question has to be pastoral. It has to be. Christ was a shepherd of sheep, a healer of wounds, a restorer of wholeness. So one of the practices that I think we must engage in is listening for the broken places, people, and institutions in our discipline, and putting our resources, that is our time, energy, money, and emotional labor, in the service of restoring wholeness to those people, places, and institutions. I'm highlighting a particular phenomenon of brokenness that I think is ripe for pastoral attention from Christian philosophers. I have some firsthand experience with this. This phenomenon is endemic in the discipline. Virtually every department and subfield has someone who has experienced this. It is no respecter of persons. People from every race, socioeconomic class, gender identity, sexual orientation, and body type all experience this phenomenon. It's been called an epidemic. Its prevalence is on the rise, and its deadliness is often not understood until it is too late. I'm talking about the phenomenon of philosophers who experience mental illness. Mental illness is complicated, and this contributes both to its stigma and to why it's so difficult to address well. One way in which it's complicated is that it's both an individual and a social phenomenon. It's individual in the sense that the symptoms that define the diagnosis are experienced by individuals, but it is social in the sense that these symptoms can either be exacerbated or ameliorated by the environment in which the individual is located, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's an ideal worker economy, or what have you. What counts as mental illness is also complicated. The line between the doldrums and an acute depressive episode, or the line between getting super nervous before a big event and an anxiety attack, is often only obvious to professionals. And to complicate things even further, this means that sometimes even the one experiencing mental illness may not even know it. The diagnostic problem is at least partially what contributes to the stigma. Philosophers fear being vulnerable about mental illness because they're unsure whether they are officially mentally ill. Am I sick enough? And they don't want to be seen as taking advantage of the system. I think philosophers in particular are susceptible of falling prey to the stigma of mental illness, given our idealization of the perfectly rational and objective mind always firing on all cylinders. The Cult of Genius research by Sarah Jane Leslie is also relevant here. If we are no longer rational along some dimension, if our minds are compromised, then our ability to do our jobs, and in some sense our very identity, is threatened. If you've experienced mental illness, I don't need to describe this anymore. You know exactly what I'm talking about, and you probably have already been down that rabbit hole. If you haven't experienced mental illness, however, let me help you. Imagine your reputation as a philosopher being compromised because of some unchangeable fact about your cognitive architecture. You realize that doing philosophy in our profession as it is currently structured requires you to force yourself to perform in a recognizably competent way, at least most of the time. The effort that this masking requires generates constant low-level stress and exhaustion. Suppose it's clear that you enjoy and are good at what you do. Nevertheless, the structure and norms of the profession, that is, the time pressure to publish, the up or out nature of tenure, the never enough workaholism, are your mental kryptonite. When the enforcement mechanisms of this professional structure and the associated professional norms become most acute, you simply stop functioning. The mask is knocked off. You withdraw and retreat, incapacitated for some indeterminate amount of time until your mind and body are able to coordinate well enough to start picking up the many balls that you have dropped while your mind forced you to a grinding halt. I hope it's clear from this description that no one would choose this state of affairs. Yet the stigma of mental illness comes from the unconscious and unstated assumption that it's somehow different, somehow more up to you than, say, diabetes or lupus. In reality, they all fit the same description: an invisible chronic condition with occasional flare-ups that, with adequate resources and care, is consistent, is compatible with living a sustainable and flourishing life, but without adequate resources and care can kill you. So, helping your colleagues and students gain access to adequate resources and care, however awkward and difficult and complex and idiosyncratic it may be, is quite literally a life-saving endeavor. How then does a Christian philosopher allow her faith to shape her interactions with colleagues and students who experience mental illness? I don't think there's a single correct answer to this, though perhaps there are some general strategies. Becoming aware of the problem, however, is a precondition for action. Let me close with some observations by Peter Railton, who publicly acknowledged the impact of depression on his career during his 2015 Dewey Lecture at the Central APA. He writes, "People ask, but when I see signs of depression in someone, what should I do? I'm no expert, but I do know that seeking help and doing so sooner rather than later is vital. I have learned discreetly that I can give someone an opening for a conversation about seeking help by talking instead about my own experiences and what help has done for me. So here today, I now give to all of you my experience. As an example, you might tell others or yourself in order to open a non-threatening conversation with yourself or others about what seeking help can do. I stand before you because others have taken initiatives to open for me the path to seeking treatment. What does it say to our students or colleagues? How does it contribute to their ability to seek care or to escape a sense of utter loneliness and inability to make it out the other side? If even people with established careers and loving families can't be open about the depression that has so deeply shaped our lives, and who can make it clear by our very selves, there's real help. You can make it. It's worth it. You're worth it. Perhaps if enough of us, of all ages and walks of life, parents, children, siblings, coworkers, spouses, relatives, deans, and directors, and department chairs, can be open about our passages through mental illness, a shadowy stigma will fade away in the broad light of day. We must call it mental illness because that's what it is, illness that takes up residence in the mind, but no more of the essence of a person than any other illness. And when we hear of mental illness, treatment should be the first thing that comes to mind, not shame and withdrawal. Perhaps if enough of us who've lived with depression pitch in and do our small bit, the true face of depression will at last be visible. It looks like all of us, only with some cells that won't behave. So let's do what we can to fix or manage that. What I think Peter Railton is trying to say here is that mental illness is not weakness or laziness. We might say, as a Christian, it is not a failure of faith. It is not a lack of trust in God because I didn't pray enough, because I refused to choose happiness. Like many other ills that plague us and our colleagues, it is simply a feature of embodiment that should elicit not shame or avoidance or fear, but rather the recognition of an opportunity to instantiate the spiritual practices of self-compassion and self-care in the case of the mentally ill, or compassion and care for those who support the mentally ill. This ought to characterize the Christian philosopher, practices of compassion and care. It is our pastoral ministry. And in any case, there is one thing that Christian philosophers cannot do in the face of mental illness, and that is nothing.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, so next we have Alicia Finch, who, in addition to co-organizing this wonderful panel, if you're wondering, how does it feel to be sitting next to all of that greatness, the answer is really good. She is going to answer for us, why should Christian philosophers care about diversity and inclusion in professional philosophy, for which there is a handout coming to you now.
Hi. Can people hear me? Okay. All right. So I am going to start with some clarifications. So I'm just stipulating that what I mean by to care about diversity and inclusion in professional philosophy is to, first, listen to philosophers and would-be philosophers who are not members of the dominant group within philosophy, and two, to do what we can to ensure that others listen to them too. Should I wait until the handouts are distributed? Or are they good? Oh, okay, I think I'll go ahead. All right, so when I say the dominant group within philosophy, I'm talking about people who are cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, by which I include mentally healthy, white men. Okay, so that's the stipulation stuff. So now, by listen, I mean that to listen to members of the non-dominant group is, well, that's complicated. That's difficult to say. But the first thing I want to be clear about is that it's not to accept everything that they/we say as true, which would be impossible anyway, because it's not as if we all agree with each other about everything. And there's nothing Christian about believing contradictions. So it's definitely not to... That is not a contradiction. Okay, triune God, not a contradiction. Okay, okay, but it does involve, at the very least, and note I'm emphasizing at the very least, seeking out written work by members of the non-dominant group, reading it and critically engaging with it, seeking out conversation with members of the non-dominant group, not being dismissive in the context of the conversation, and critically engaging with what they say. And then here's something that's going a step further, which is seeking out and taking seriously what they have said or written about their experiences as members of the non-dominant group. Okay, so that's step one, listening. Now, as far as what we can do to ensure that others listen to members of the non-dominant group, I'm just going to give a few examples. There's a lot more to be said about this, but just a few examples. We can assign the work of members of the non-dominant group in our classes. We can cite the work of members of the non-dominant group in our research. If we are organizing a conference, inviting colloquium speakers, or editing a volume, we can make sure to include qualified members of non-dominant groups. And if we are on a hiring committee or admissions committee, we can make sure that applications from members of the non-dominant group are given their due. There's a lot more to say about this, which we can maybe talk about in Q&A, but I actually want to move on now to the question of why Christian philosophers should do the things that I have suggested. At this point, I have a confession. It seems obvious to me that Christians, qua Christians, should be doing the things that I just mentioned. So I'm not really sure how to argue for it because it seems so obvious. I also don't understand Christian opposition to it, and I know that there is some. So maybe I'll gain an understanding on one or both of these matters during the Q&A. But for now, I'm just going to gesture at the line of reasoning that leads me to the thesis in question. So this brings us to the argument such as it is, which is on the back of the handout. So I'm just going to begin with Matthew 25, verses 31 to 45. More specifically, with Jesus' claim that at the final judgment, the Lord will say, "Whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me, and what you did not do for one of the least ones, you did not do for me." When I consider these passages alongside various other claims from the Old and New Testaments, I cannot help but conclude that, premise one, Christians ought to be particularly concerned about fellow human beings who are oppressed and/or subjected to systemic injustices. Okay, now, it also seems obvious to me that, two, if Christians ought to be particularly concerned about fellow human beings who are oppressed and/or subjected to systemic injustices, and if we know that members of a particular group contend that they are oppressed and/or subjected to systemic injustices, we ought to seek out and listen to what members of this group say about their experiences of oppression and/or systemic injustice. But now since, three, we know that members of the non-dominant group in philosophy have said that they are oppressed and/or subjected to systemic injustices, I can't help but conclude that, four, Christians ought to seek out and listen to what members of the non-dominant group in philosophy say about their experiences of oppression and/or systemic injustice. Okay, so that's how I take myself to have gotten to step one, that we should be listening. Let's go on to step two, which is supposed to be the claim that we should try to amplify the voices of people who are expressing their experiences as members of the non-dominant group. I know that what I'm about to say is controversial, but I contend that once one listens to what the members of the non-dominant group in philosophy are saying about their experiences of oppression and/or systemic injustice, one cannot help but think that members of the non-dominant group in philosophy have been oppressed, or at the very least, subjected to systemic injustices. In other words, there is injustice in the philosophy profession. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to offer a general principle. I may not have formulated it quite right. I'm not an ethicist, so it's good to be here where maybe others can help me get it right. But I think something like this is right. I find it difficult to deny when I'm confronted with the gospel. If a Christian confronts an injustice in the world, and if the Christian can perform some action, the performance of which would tend to ameliorate that injustice, and if performing this action is neither unjust in itself nor apt to promote injustice, then the Christian ought to perform the action in question. Okay, I'm now going to add a claim that I also think is going to be controversial, but which seems plausible to me, which is that doing what we can to ensure that other people listen to members of the non-dominant group in philosophy tends to ameliorate the injustices suffered by members of that group. It is not unjust in itself, and it is not apt to promote injustice. So with this, I conclude that Christian philosophers ought to listen to philosophers who are not members of the dominant group within philosophy, and they also ought to do what they can to ensure that others listen to them too. Thank you.
All right, we have one more speaker who unfortunately could not be with us in the flesh, but we think that, confronting, diversifying our conferences means creatively responding to problems and coming up with creative solutions. So Samir Yadav is gonna join us now and talk to us about why racial diversity should matter to Christian philosophy. So welcome, Samir.
Hello. Can everybody see me? Am I a big floating head above everyone?
You are a brain in a vat.
Okay. Hi. I'm even worse than an ethicist. I'm a philosophical theologian. So, and so what I'm about to deliver is something of a philosophical sermon, I guess. So forgive me for that. I wonder is there any way I could actually see people rather than seeing some bars and a door? Is that? Okay. Or if I could just look Justin in the eyes, that would be fine too. Hello. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm fine. Hey. Okay. All right. John Stuart Mill famously quipped in Utilitarianism that, quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool, or the pig, is of a different opinion, it is only because they only know their own side of the question." Part of Mill's point is that it is a distinctive feature of humanity not only to seek satisfaction from the goods that sustain our lives, but to also seek satisfaction in our reflection on the grounds of those goods. And the point I want to emphasize, which is independent of Mill's utilitarian framework, thank God, is just that we should not allow ourselves to be satisfied simply when we've managed to secure our own interests, without any due reflection on whether the goods and privileges we enjoy have been secured rightly or wrongly, justly or unjustly. A fool is like a pig in being satisfied with ignorance about the moral or practical grounds of the goods and privileges they enjoy. The wisdom of Socrates, the characteristic wisdom of the philosopher, on the other hand, consists in being willing to critically inquire about the moral and prudential status of our satisfactions and dissatisfactions, even if it means enduring the pain of discovering that their nature and distributions are illicit. If we turn from John Stuart Mill to Charles Mills, we find Mills commenting back in the 1990s on the goods and privileges associated with racial representation in the Philosophical Academy. In the introduction to the Racial Contract, Mills observes that, quote, "Philosophy has remained remarkably untouched by the debates over multiculturalism, canon reform, the ethnic diversity racking the academy. Both demographically and conceptually, it is one of the widest of the humanities. Blacks, for example, constitute only about 1% of philosophers in North American universities, 100 or so people out of more than 10,000. And there are even fewer Latino, Asian American, Native American, or other non-white philosophers. Surely this underrepresentation itself stands in need of an explanation." The numbers have admittedly improved slightly since this was written, but not by much or by enough. And arguably the SCP is wider than philosophy more generally. And that's whiter, why not wider? I think it's fair to say that the most prevalent kinds of responses to Christian philosophy's whiteness have heretofore been insufficiently reflective about white privilege in Christian philosophy. There are those Christian philosophers who identify Christian philosophy's whiteness as a problem that requires amelioration, perhaps by way of more policies of inclusion, by more welcoming climate for non-white perspectives. And there are also those who regard the confrontation of white privilege in Christian philosophy as a particularly dangerous and unbiblical form of neo-Marxist identity politics that threatens to erode the intellectual integrity of Christian philosophy. And if that attitude sounds like a caricature, of that position to you, then I have a recent article by a very well-known Christian philosopher in the Christian Post that I'd be happy to share with you, or rather unhappy. But what I find lacking in these various responses to Christian philosophy's whiteness within the SCP is any deep or sustained philosophical reflection on what accounts for the white dominance of Christian philosophy in its present social arrangements. The whiteness of Christian philosophy, to put it in Mill's terms, stands in need of an explanation. Apart from the reflections required for an analysis and explanation of our lack of racial diversity, any attempts to either ameliorate that lack or else to reject the politics of that amelioration would be foolish. When it comes to the question of race, Christian philosophy has remained, for the most part, a satisfied pig. We have, for the most part, proceeded with the activity of Christian philosophy as if that activity has not in any relevant sense been shaped by the most historically important social and political systems in the Western world of the past several hundred years, a system of white supremacy and white cultural domination. Remarking on the curriculum of political philosophy, as it is standardly practiced, Mills remarks that, quote, though it covers more than 2,000 years of Western political thought and runs the ostensible gambit of political systems, there will be no mention of the basic political system that has shaped the world for the past several hundred years. And this omission is not accidental. Rather, it reflects the fact that standard textbooks and courses have, for the most part, been written and designed by white people for white people, who take their racial privilege so much for granted that they do not even see it as political, as a form of domination. Ironically, the most important political system of the recent global history, the system of domination by which white people have historically ruled over and in certain important ways continue to rule over non-white people, is not seen as a political system at all. It is just taken for granted. It is the background against which other systems, which are to be seen as political, are to be highlighted. End quote. What Mills says about the uncanny ignorance of political philosophy could equally well be said of Christian philosophy, as it currently is constituted. It tends to proceed in theory and in practice as if it had not at all been touched by its social and political patrimony, as if the practical and intellectual climate in which Christian philosophy has birthed and grown to maturity had no bearing on its purported goods, its questions, its principal beneficiaries, its most influential conversation partners. If the future of Christian philosophy is to retain its integrity as philosophy, therefore, I think that future ought to include a more serious intellectual and practical effort on the part of Christian philosophers to attend to the role that race plays in shaping the moral, prudential, and epistemic values of our work. But I also think that we should go further in recognizing that what's at stake in addressing our discipline's race problem, and it is a race problem, is also the integrity of our Christian confession. Christian identity, after all, purports to be a form of belonging in which all forms of human enmity are reconciled in Christ. The form of that reconciliation, St. Paul tells us, is the form of Christ's crucifixion, one in which the weak and subjugated are exalted by God, the strong and dominant are made weak to demonstrate God's strength, as St. Paul puts it, my favorite quote of this small talk. Quote, where is the philosopher of this age? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and Greeks, a foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were before you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards, not many influential, not many of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world, the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. So in answer to the question posed before me, what does racial diversity matter to Christian philosophy? I want to say that racial diversity does not matter per se to Christian philosophy, But a serious interrogation of race-based thought and agency does matter for philosophy, because it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And an interrogation of that sort matters for Christian philosophy, because it is better to be Jesus crucified than Socrates dissatisfied. If, as a white Christian philosopher, you are of a different opinion, it's probably because, as Mill says, you only know your own side of the question. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for just really insightful reflections, and I think some important things to think